Hey guys, welcome back to Reserved Investments on YouTube. So in this particular video, we're going to talk about learning how to evaluate the supply of third-party graded collectibles. Now I know already what you're thinking. You're going to turn this video off because, Sean, all I got to do is log on to cgccomics.com, use the census, and I can find out how many copies of any comic book I want to buy are out there in each subsequent grade. I don't need you to sit there in your basement office and tell me how to do this. And I'm going to say, okay, fair enough. You're absolutely right. If you want to know how many copies of Amazing Spider-Man 300 are out there in each subsequent grade, graded by CGC, I can tell you that CGC alone has graded, as of January 22nd, the year 2020, 20,949 copies. And for those of you that think this is a great investment comic book, there are 1,247 copies of Amazing Spider-Man 300 in 9.8 condition, with 10 copies in 9.9 condition. Now here's an interesting tidbit. There are no copies of this comic book in 10.0 condition. That is kind of interesting. So if somebody does out there think that they have a 10 copy, a gem mint copy of Amazing Spider-Man 300, I would encourage you to send it in to get graded, or at least try to get it graded, because if it does come back at 10, which is very unlikely given the fact that 20,949 people have already tried to submit copies, and the highest that came back thus far was a 9.9, you would be sitting on a gold mine, because I'm sure there's some crazy person out there that wants that comic book. And obviously, I forget what a 9.9 goes for in the marketplace today, but a 10.0, if it was the only one after this length of time, it would probably sell for a significant amount. Now, why am I starting off the video doing this particular segment or exercise? The reason is because I know that anybody out there with a computer who can log into any of these grading companies can pretty much figure out how many graded copies there are of a particular item at present time. But we want to go deeper than that. We want to have a serious discussion here, because when we look at the market for CGC comic books, CGC has been around since the year 2003. As a result of that, the population reports are now valid and also stable. When we look at a lot of these grading companies, though, that have just sprung up over the last few years, whether we're talking about WATA Games, or even if you want to go into the hardcore antique coin collecting realm, if we talk about NGC grading ancient coins, NGC has only been grading ancient coins for the past year, 2 years, 3 years at most. As a result, that particular segment of the market, if we try to view the population reports for those particular items, it's going to be skewed, guys, because a lot of people that have ancient coins are not rushing to send them in to get graded at present time. Whereas a lot of people who have CGC comic books, or I should say raw comic books, do know that CGC is out there. And most of these people, because CGC has been in existence since the year, 2003, they have already become aware of comic grading and have either said, you know what, I'm going to send my comic books in to get graded, or they said, you know what, I don't want any part of grading, and they're holding off, which is fine. But the majority of these population reports for established collectibles are already predetermined, because a lot of these companies were formed decades ago. And this is something that I really want to hit on. Third-party grading for collectibles came out of the coin grading realm. Back in the 1980s, it was NGC and PCGS who introduced the idea of grading third-party collectibles and encasing them in a hard plastic case. Since that time, of course, we've had multiple other collecting categories that have been engulfed by the advent of third-party grading. Well, ironically, for those of you that like to argue that, coin collecting is boring, or investing in rare coins is really boring, Sean, I agree with you. It's not as exciting as putting your money into a lot of these speculative collectibles or other collecting categories that have sprung up over the past few years that are highly speculative. But one thing you got to understand, if I want to look up the value of an 1891 Carson City Morgan silver dollar in mint state 64, I have 40 years of data to go on. Coin grading premiered in the 1980s. It takes a decade or more for the population reports that a lot of these third-party grading companies put out to become stable, in my opinion. Meaning there's a lot of people who, even for the first 5-10 years of a grading company hitting the market, don't understand that these companies are out there, that you can send them your collectibles and they'll grade them. Also, you have to understand that different people are at different points in their lives. Remember, I use this as an example. For me, if I go through my house and I find a $1,500 item that I could send to WATA Games or I can send to AFA to get graded, certified, and then sell, I'm probably not going to take that as a priority because of where I'm at in my life right now. But if I was a 20-year-old, maybe a 30-year-old person who just got his first job in corporate America, who's making $30,000 a year, $35,000 a year, and I find a $1,500 collectible that I know I can certify and sell, that may become a priority to me. So that may cause me to act on getting that graded and sold more quickly than someone who may be in a different segment or has different priorities in their life. So it's important to look at that from that standpoint. Another thing, I get a lot of feedback and a lot of comments against my commentary on graded video games, graded Magic cards, graded Pokemon cards. Now, before I even respond to this, it's fair to point out, none of these items are going to go to zero. I'm not sitting here trying to tell you guys that graded video games or Pokemon cards or Magic the Gathering cards are all going to become worthless overnight. No one's going to care about these items 10, 20, 30 years from now. What I am saying, though, is the market is extremely speculative at present time because there's a lot of unknowns going on in these markets. Let me explain. When I go after coins, when I go after pieces of currency, I have several decades of data in front of me where I can pretty much go back and look at what these items sold for when they were third-party graded at a specific point in time. If you want to look at a copy of The Legend of Zelda graded by WATA Games in 9.4 condition that's factory sealed, and you're looking at it right now in the market, you can't go back 5-10 years if you want to get a value of that item when it was graded. Now, I know what some of you guys are going to come back at me with. Sean, that's not true. VGA was in existence long before WATA Games. Well, let me ask you something. How successful was VGA? And don't get me wrong, VGA is a well-respected, prominent company. They were formed out of AFA, Action Figure Authority. That's why I always criticize a lot of people out there that collect vintage toys, and they'll have a lot of AFA items in their collection. Then you mention the topic of VGA, and they go, VGA, I don't like them. They don't know what they're doing. And it's like, well, it's the same company that graded your vintage Star Wars figures right over there. So if they don't know what they're doing with video games, how come you have all these vintage toys graded by them? Makes no sense to me. But I just put that out there, guys, because when VGA premiered about, 10 years ago, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, I don't have the exact date, they were not seen as a very prominent player in that particular marketplace. In fact, up until 5 years ago, video game grading was seen as very esoteric. I remember threads on Nintendo Age that used to get very heated because a lot of collectors and speculators would enter that thread, and there was a lot of guys pushing for third-party grading of video games. Well, it caused a lot of tension on that site at the time because there were a lot of people that were like, I don't like this VGA thing. Even WATA Games right now, I guarantee if you poll my viewers, any of my viewers that watch this channel, and you go, do you agree with third-party grading of video games? You would probably get 50% would say yes. Another 50% would say no, I think it's a racket. And in my opinion, calling it a racket is unfair. Third-party grading, when done right, is very respectable, and it brings a lot of confidence to the market in question. I've said this before. I have nothing against the product or service that VGA or WATA Games brings to the market. They both have good and bad points about each company. The problem that I have is when they engage in market manipulation in regards to the secondary market. That is something you do not do when you are a grading company, and I stand by my stance on that particular statement. Well, getting back to the point at hand here, one of the things that I don't think that people realize at present time, if you want to go and you want to buy a factory sealed vintage video game, let's say a Nintendo game, right now you don't have all the information to work with to make that price evaluation on the secondary market. So when we go back to evaluating the monetary value or supply of third-party graded collectibles, if you're going after any graded game that's done by WATA, WATA's only been in existence for 1 or 2 or 3 years, depending on how you look at when they came on the scene and when they kind of caught on. Well, in that time span, not everybody who collects factory sealed Nintendo games or the like has been sending them items. So we realistically do not know how many copies of a game like Kid Icarus from 1988 that's factory sealed are out there on the market today. Just like we don't know how many copies of Castlevania for the original Nintendo are out there on the market today. That's why, guys, a lot of these auction companies and a lot of these very high-value collectors out there are placing a lot of provenance on first print games. That's a form of market manipulation. Now, I don't disagree with that happening on the secondary market, but there's a lot of people out there that are pushing for some of these items to be known or labeled as first print, or this is the first release. You don't understand. This is so iconic. Because automatically, they know there's going to be very few copies of those games overall in existence. And number two, they also then don't have to worry if somebody else comes on the market and says, hey, I have these other 5 copies of Mega Man that I'm going to get graded, and they're going to hit the secondary market. Well, if you have everybody convinced this is a first print, and it doesn't matter, I understand that it's legit how they define a first print. I'm not arguing against that. But what it does is it kind of protects or acts as an insurance towards that buyer who paid $75,000 for that first print copy of Mega Man. Because what that person is thinking in their head is, how many realistically other copies of this particular first print game are going to be graded by WATA in 9.4 condition from the mid to late 80s when Nintendo was king? Because Nintendo really didn't catch on, I'm talking about the original Nintendo Entertainment System, until really about late 1987, 88. That's when a lot of people were caught up in the Nintendo craze. And by that point, already NEC TurboGrafx and Sega Genesis were coming on the scene to compete, and Nintendo was already getting ready to release the Super Nintendo just several years later. But going back to this, you have to take that into account. One of the reasons that I will never invest in factory sealed graded games, whether they're graded by WATA or VGA, is simply I don't have all the knowledge to make an educated decision on what's available at the market and what these items should be selling for reasonably on the secondary market. This ties into a lot of my other videos, guys. I talk about how chances are the average person out there who buys a WATA graded video game right now, if they pay $10,000 for that item, and 5-10 years, a lot of more copies of that game enter the secondary marketplace, and the population reports or the census reports fills up, the value of that game could easily drop from $10,000 all the way down to $8,000 or $5,000. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, and people argue with me on this point as well, you will have people who paid $5,000 for a game that just by nature, because of rarity or demand, goes to $10,000. The question that I ask you guys is, are you willing to take the risk? Can you afford to take the risk? Do you have the stamina to take the risk? Are you even financially solvent enough to take a risk like that? Because one thing I can tell you from coming from a coin collector who goes after coins that sell for $2,000 all the way up to $25,000 in the secondary market, when you look at your collection and you start realizing, oh my gosh, I have $250,000 tied up in coins and or currency here sitting in a safety deposit box, you start to realize, you know, if I sold this collection, $250,000 invested at 5% alone is going to net me what? $12,500 a year just in interest and dividend payments. So do I keep the coin collection, or do I sit here and start thinking, you know, maybe I should consign this collection to auction and I can collect $12,500 a year for every year that I'm alive, assuming all things are created equal and stay stable in the financial market that I would invest that money into, which we know really isn't realistic. But even if I get $10,000 a year on income stream out of that money, is it really worth keeping a $250,000 collection locked up in a safety deposit box? These are questions you have to ask yourself before you get into these markets. One of the things I'm always amazed of on the consulting end of the trade, somebody will come to me and they'll put in front of me, and I think I brought this up in another video, they'll put in front of me a want list. And I'll sit there and I'll look at their want list and I'll say, okay, realistically, if you went after these 20 items, you would be spending $100,000 or $200,000 on the secondary market. What's your time frame to acquire these items? And do you have that kind of money to put and lock up in this one collecting category? And you know, most people that come to me with that list, after I go through this list with them that they brought me and I talk it out with them, they can't even answer the question. So if you're struggling to pay your mortgage, you have a car payment, you have a school loan, you have credit card debt, perhaps if you're coming to someone like me with a list of 20 or 10 collectibles that's going to cost close to $100,000 to acquire on the secondary market, perhaps that's fantasy. You have to understand that all this is relative to what you do in your life, how much money you make, and how it ties in to your financial success and or well-being. There's a lot of people out there that get into collecting these items and they convince themselves that everything they buy is an investment to justify the purchase. Well, if you don't have a written plan or you're not able to analyze these markets, like I just quoted at the beginning of this video, how many copies of Amazing Spider-Man 300 are out there just graded by CGC? Now, I'm going to tell you something. If somebody comes to me and says, my copy of Amazing Spider-Man 300 is an investment, I'm going to say, I'm sorry, but just alone in 9.8 condition, there's 1,247 copies out there. So you can argue that's a major Bronze Age key. I agree with you. Amazing Spider-Man 300, first appearance of Venom, is a key issue. But is it really an investment grade item? And is it something that you would want to put your money into long term, knowing that just at current state of looking at these population reports, there's 1,247 of them out there in 9.8 condition alone. Now, I already know some people in the comment section, they're going to come at me and they're going to say, Sean, there's probably 500,000, 1 million comic book collectors in the United States alone. That's a very small amount. That's why it sells for a premium in the secondary market. Well, all things are relative. You still have to take that into the equation. And when you look at some of these items, you can't possibly state that a 9.8 copy of Amazing Spider-Man 300 is rare in 9.8 condition, because I can log right on to these population reports and tell you it's not. Even if these numbers are a little inflated, which, let me give you a hint, most of the numbers on third-party graded websites are inflated because a lot of people play the crack-out game, and they'll crack out the item and try to send it in for a higher grade, and if it doesn't get at that grade, it gets graded again, possibly at the same grade it was, or it can even drop a grade because of the handling. Well, a lot of people don't take that into consideration. So I'll tell you this right now. There probably isn't 1,247 copies of Amazing Spider-Man 300 in CGC 9.8 out there. It's probably really 1,140 some copies, just to use that as an example. So when you analyze these markets, just be cognizant to know that if you're looking at graded video games, you have to understand we don't have all the data yet. We don't know how many copies of each game is out there. It's all speculation. That's also why, guys, the prices on the secondary market at present time are speculative. It's all related. There is a direct correlation there. If I put up a 1891 Carson City Morgan Silver Dollar on eBay, graded by PCGS in MS64, and it has good eye appeal overall, I can pretty much tell you, if I put it up for 99 cents, what parameters that item's going to go for on the low end of the market and or the high end of the market. Now, there's exceptions to every rule, but the coin marketplace has been established with third-party grading since the 1980s. So just let that sink in. Just understand that if you're getting in any of these speculative markets, whether we're talking about graded video games or even NGC ancient coins at present time, the grading population reports are not there yet to make an honest and educated financial decision as to what those items should sell for in the secondary market. So please use caution. That's the only point I want to convey in this video. Thank you for watching. I hope this video has helped you. If it has, please consider subscribing. Thanks, guys, and have a great night.